April 27th, 2010, Washington, D.C. The marble halls of the Senate are about to witness something extraordinary. Lloyd Blankfein, CEO of Goldman Sachs, sits before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. His $2,000 suit is immaculate. His expression? Carefully controlled. Senator Carl Levin leans forward, holding up an internal email. He reads it aloud, slowly, deliberately. Quote, "Boy, that Timberwolf was one shitty deal." The email was written by a Goldman Sachs employee about a product Goldman had just sold to its own clients, a product Goldman knew was worthless. Levin looks directly at Blankfein. Should Goldman Sachs be trying to sell a shitty deal? The question hangs in the air, because here's what that email reveals. Goldman Sachs didn't just survive the 2008 financial crisis. They profited from it, massively, while pension funds collapsed, while retirement accounts evaporated, while millions of Americans lost their homes. Goldman Sachs made billions betting against the very securities they were selling to their clients. They bet against their own customers. They bet against the American economy, and they won. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented fact, proven in Senate hearings, confirmed in court settlements, admitted in emails that Goldman executives thought would never see daylight. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is how a company could do this to its clients, claim to be doing God's work, and walk away with $13 billion in profit while the world burned. This is the story of the greatest con in Wall Street history. Not a crime in the traditional sense, but something far more dangerous, perfectly legal betrayal. To understand what Goldman Sachs did, you first need to understand what they were supposed to be. Goldman Sachs was founded in 1869 by Marcus Goldman, a Bavarian immigrant who started by lending money to New York merchants. For over a century, Goldman built a reputation as Wall Street's most trusted advisor. When a company needed to raise capital, when a billionaire needed investment advice, when a government needed financial counsel, they called Goldman Sachs. The firm operated on a principle. Their clients came first, always. It was more than a slogan. It was supposed to be sacred. Goldman's business principles, published in 1979, stated explicitly, "Our clients' interests always come first." That reputation made them powerful. By 2006, Goldman Sachs was managing assets worth $840 billion. They advised Fortune 500 companies, sovereign wealth funds, pension systems, and university endowments. People trusted Goldman with their financial futures, but something had changed. Goldman Sachs had transformed from an investment advisor into something else entirely, a massive trading operation betting with its own money. In 1999, Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, Depression-era legislation that separated traditional banking from risky investment speculation. The walls came down. Banks that once served customers could now compete with them. Goldman went public in 1999, raising $3.6 billion. Partnership culture, where partners risked their own wealth, gave way to quarterly earnings targets and shareholder demands. The incentives shifted. Personal accountability faded. By 2005, Goldman's trading division was generating more profit than their traditional advisory business. They weren't just facilitating deals anymore. They were making billion-dollar bets with the firm's capital. And in 2006, they noticed something alarming. The housing market, the foundation of the global financial system, was about to collapse. Here's what they saw. Subprime mortgages were being issued to borrowers who couldn't afford them. These mortgages were packaged into complex securities called collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs. These CDOs were sliced into layers called tranches, rated by agencies as away, supposedly as safe as U.S. Treasury bonds. But they weren't safe. They were toxic. In December 2006, Goldman's mortgage department suffered its worst month in history, losses of $476 million. The head of the department, a trader named Daniel Sparks, sent an urgent message up the chain. Well, the housing market was crashing, faster than anyone expected. Goldman's leadership faced a choice. They could warn their clients, the pension funds, insurance companies, and investors who trusted them. They could stop selling mortgage-backed securities, or they could do something else. In December 2006, Goldman Sachs executives held a meeting. The minutes from that meeting would later become evidence in a Senate investigation. The decision was made. Goldman would get closer to home. Wall Street jargon for reducing risk. But here's the crucial part. They didn't just reduce risk, they flipped the script entirely. Goldman Sachs decided to bet against the housing market, massively. They would short mortgage-backed securities, profiting when they collapsed, while simultaneously selling those same securities to their clients. The mechanics of what Goldman did are complex, but the essence is simple. It's a con, a sophisticated legal multi-billion-dollar con. Here's how it worked. Goldman Sachs created synthetic CDOs, essentially custom-made betting vehicles built from mortgage-backed securities. They gave them names like Timberwolf, Anderson, and Abacus. These CDOs were marketed to investors as solid investments. Goldman salespeople would approach pension funds in Germany, insurance companies in Asia, university endowments in the United States. They'd present these products as safe, AAA-rated securities backed by American mortgages. What Goldman didn't tell these clients, they were simultaneously taking the opposite position. Goldman was shorting these very same securities, betting they would fail. Let's focus on one deal. Abacus 2007 AC1. In April 2007, Goldman created Abacus at the request of John Paulson, a hedge fund manager who believed the housing market would crash. Paulson wanted to bet against subprime mortgages, but he needed someone to take the other side. Goldman created a synthetic CDO worth $1 billion, a collection of mortgage-backed securities that Paulson himself helped select. Paulson chose the worst mortgages he could find, the most likely to default. Then Goldman sold this CDO to investors, to IKB, Deutsche Industrie Bank, a German bank, to ACA Management, an insurance company. Goldman told these clients that an independent expert had selected the mortgages. They didn't mention that Paulson, who was betting against these mortgages, had essentially chosen them. IKB invested $150 million. Within 9 months, those mortgages defaulted. IKB lost everything. Paulson made $1 billion. Goldman made $15 million in fees and profited from its own short positions. But Abacus was just one deal. Goldman created 25 Abacus CDOs between 2004 and 2007, totaling $10.9 billion. And Abacus wasn't even the worst. In March 2007, Goldman created Timberwolf, a CDO stuffed with subprime mortgages that Goldman's own risk managers had flagged as dangerous. Internal Goldman emails called it one shitty deal. They sold it anyway, to pension funds, to insurance companies, to investors who trusted Goldman's reputation. Goldman made $290 million in fees from Timberwolf. The investors? Within 5 months, Timberwolf had lost 80% of its value. Here's the pattern. Goldman created these CDOs, took short positions betting they would fail, then sold them to clients as good investments. When the CDOs collapsed, Goldman's clients lost billions, Goldman made billions, and here's the truly audacious part. Goldman claimed they were simply market making, facilitating transactions between buyers and sellers. They argued they had no obligation to tell clients they were betting against the products they were selling. Imagine a car dealer selling you a vehicle, then immediately buying insurance that pays him when that car breaks down. Now imagine he knew the brakes were faulty. That's what Goldman did, at the largest scale in financial history. By early 2007, Goldman had accumulated short positions worth billions. They were betting against the entire housing market. Their own research analysts were publicly telling clients that housing was strong, that subprime mortgage securities were safe investments. Internally, Goldman executives knew the truth. In February 2007, David Viniar, Goldman's chief financial officer, received a message. Goldman's short positions had made $51 million in a single day as mortgages collapsed. Viniar's response, in an email, tells you what might be happening to people who don't have the big short. The people who don't have the big short, that meant Goldman's clients. Goldman's traders even had a dark running joke. They called themselves the Big Short. They laughed about the pension funds and insurance companies who trusted them, who were about to lose everything. By summer 2007, Goldman was completely hedged, meaning they had structured their positions so that no matter what happened to the housing market, they would profit. But they kept selling. Even after they'd protected themselves, Goldman continued selling mortgage-backed securities to clients. Deals like Hudson Mezzanine, Anderson, Timberwolf, billions of dollars in transactions. Why? Because they made fees on every transaction, and because their traders were compensated based on volume, not whether their clients made money. In 2007, Goldman Sachs employees received $20 billion in compensation, the highest in the firm's history. Lloyd Blankfein personally received $68.5 million. The housing market was collapsing, Goldman's clients were hemorrhaging money, and Goldman executives were getting rich. By early 2008, the truth was impossible to hide. The housing market wasn't just declining, it was in complete freefall. In March 2008, Bear Stearns collapsed. The fifth largest investment bank in America, destroyed in 4 days by exposure to subprime mortgages. JP Morgan bought the corpse for $2 per share. Bear Stearns had been worth $172 per share the year before. Wall Street panicked. If Bear Stearns could fall, anyone could, except Goldman Sachs. While other banks were hemorrhaging losses, Goldman reported record profits for the first quarter of 2008, $81 billion. How? Their short positions. As mortgage-backed securities collapsed, Goldman's bets paid off. While their clients lost everything, Goldman made $3.7 billion from their short positions. The financial press praised Goldman's risk management, but some analysts started asking uncomfortable questions. How did Goldman know to short the market, and why didn't they warn their clients? In April 2008, a portfolio manager at Queens College in New York noticed something strange. Goldman had sold them $100 million in mortgage-backed securities in 2007. Those securities were now worthless. But Goldman had emerged unscathed. He started making calls to other pension funds, other university endowments. The story was the same everywhere. Goldman had sold them mortgage securities in 2007. Those securities had collapsed, and Goldman had somehow avoided losses. Journalists began investigating. The Wall Street Journal published stories about Goldman's short positions. The New York Times raised questions about conflicts of interest. But the mainstream narrative was still about Goldman's brilliance. They'd seen the crisis coming. They'd protected themselves through superior analysis and risk management. What wasn't yet public, the internal emails, the evidence that Goldman had knowingly sold securities they believed were worthless, that evidence was sitting in Goldman's servers. Thousands of emails between traders, executives, and salespeople. Communications that revealed the truth about what Goldman had done. In July 2008, a team at the Securities and Exchange Commission began reviewing Goldman's trading activity. They requested documents, internal communications, trading records. Goldman complied. But the SEC investigation moved slowly. The agency was understaffed, overwhelmed by the scope of the crisis. Dozens of financial institutions were under investigation simultaneously. Then September arrived, and the entire financial system nearly collapsed. September 15th, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. $639 billion in assets, gone. The largest bankruptcy in American history. The stock market went into freefall. Credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending to each other. The global financial system was hours away from total collapse. The federal government intervened. The Treasury Department and Federal Reserve launched an unprecedented bailout. $700 billion in taxpayer money to rescue the financial system. And Goldman Sachs was at the center of it all. On September 21st, 2008, the Federal Reserve approved Goldman's request to become a bank holding company. This designation gave Goldman access to emergency federal funding, essentially a government backstop. But here's where it gets even more controversial. The Treasury Secretary at the time was Hank Paulson, former CEO of Goldman Sachs. Paulson orchestrated the bailout. He decided which firms would receive government money, which would survive, which would be allowed to fail. Goldman Sachs received $10 billion directly from the Treasury. But that was just the beginning. Goldman had billions in contracts with AIG, the insurance giant. When AIG collapsed, the government bailed out AIG with $85 billion. Then AIG paid Goldman $12.9 billion. At 100 cents on the dollar for the worthless mortgage-backed securities Goldman had insured with them. Goldman got their money. Taxpayers footed the bill. Public outrage was building. People were losing their homes. Unemployment was skyrocketing. Retirement accounts had evaporated. And the banks responsible, the banks that had caused the crisis, were being rescued with taxpayer money. Goldman became a symbol of greed, of corruption, of a system rigged for the wealthy and connected. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, led by Senator Carl Levin, launched a comprehensive investigation into the financial crisis. They subpoenaed Goldman Sachs, demanded internal emails, trading records, executive communications. What they found would expose the truth. The Senate hearings began on April 27, 2010. They would last 2 days, and they would reveal everything. Senator Levin opened with a simple statement. We're going to pull back the curtain on a world most Americans never see, the world of high finance, where conflicts of interest are standard practice. Then the emails, hundreds of internal Goldman Sachs communications obtained through subpoena, projected on screens for the world to see. Email from a Goldman trader about Timberwolf. Boy, that Timberwolf was one shitty deal. Another email about a different CDO. There is no way I can be involved in a transaction that is so conceptually challenged. An email from Thomas Montag, Goldman's sales chief. The business is totally dead. We are in a bad spot. And yet, Goldman kept selling. The emails showed Goldman employees expressing disgust at the products they were marketing to clients, calling them junk, crap, shitty, then selling them anyway. Lloyd Blankfein testified. So did CFO David Viniar. So did Daniel Sparks, former head of the mortgage department. Senator Levin confronted Sparks directly. Did you tell your clients you were betting against the very securities you were selling them? Sparks deflected. We were market making. We were providing liquidity. Levin wasn't having it. Did you disclose to your clients that you had a short position? We didn't have a duty to disclose. That was Goldman's defense. They had no legal obligation to tell clients they were betting against them. Levin read more emails. One from Fabrice Touré, the Goldman executive who created the Abacus deals. Touré had written to his girlfriend, the whole edifice might collapse at any moment. He wrote that in January 2007. While Goldman was selling billions in mortgage-backed securities, the testimony dragged on. Hours of obfuscation, of carefully worded non-answers, of executives claiming they couldn't recall specific transactions. But the emails didn't lie. The pattern was clear. Goldman had known the mortgage market was collapsing. They'd bet against it, they'd profited massively, and they'd sold toxic securities to clients without disclosing their positions. Senator Claire McCaskill summed it up. You're the bookie. You're the gambler. You're the house. You're the guy tipping the dealer. It's unbelievable. The hearing ended, but the damage was done. Goldman's reputation, built over 140 years, was in ruins. Public outrage reached a fever pitch. Protesters gathered outside Goldman's Manhattan headquarters. Signs read, "Jump you and make Goldman Sachs pay." Rolling Stone magazine published an article by Matt Taibbi describing Goldman as a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. The phrase stuck. Goldman became synonymous with Wall Street corruption. But public shame wasn't enough. The question was, would there be legal consequences? The Securities and Exchange Commission had already acted. On April 16th, 2010, 11 days before the Senate hearing, the SEC filed a civil lawsuit against Goldman Sachs. The charge? Fraud. Specifically, Goldman had misled investors about the Abacus 2007 AC1 deal, failing to disclose that John Paulson had helped select the mortgages and was betting against them. Goldman fought the lawsuit. They argued they'd done nothing illegal, that their practices were standard, that every sophisticated investor understood the risks. But the evidence was overwhelming. The SEC had the emails, the communications showing Goldman knew exactly what they were doing. But in July 2010, Goldman settled. They agreed to pay $550 million, the largest penalty ever paid by a Wall Street firm to the SEC at that time. In the settlement announcement, Goldman acknowledged that marketing materials for the Abacus transaction contained incomplete information. Incomplete information. That was Goldman's admission. Not fraud, not betrayal. Incomplete information. Goldman paid the fine. Look, no executives went to jail. No criminal charges were filed. $550 million sounds like a lot, until you realize Goldman had made over $13 billion from their short positions in 2007 and 2008. The settlement was a rounding error. Cost of doing business, but it wasn't over. More lawsuits were coming. In the years following the financial crisis, Goldman Sachs faced a cascade of legal actions. In 2013, Goldman paid $1.2 billion to settle claims from pension funds and investors who'd lost money on mortgage-backed securities Goldman had sold them. In 2014, they paid $3.15 billion to settle claims that they'd misled investors about the quality of mortgage securities during the housing boom. In 2016, Goldman agreed to pay $5.06 billion, the largest settlement in the firm's history, to resolve federal and state investigations into their role in the financial crisis. Total fines and settlements, over $9 billion between 2008 and 2016. Goldman could afford it. In 2010 alone, the firm reported profits of $8.35 billion. The fines were painful but not crippling. They were simply absorbed into the cost of operations. And the executives? Lloyd Blankfein remained CEO until 2018. He retired with an estimated net worth of over $1 billion. David Vinyar retired as CFO in 2013. He served on multiple corporate boards and remained wealthy beyond measure. Fabrice Touré, the architect of the Abacus deals, was found liable for civil fraud by the SEC in 2013. He was fined $825,000 and banned from working in the securities industry. But he never faced criminal charges. He went on to earn a PhD in economics and now teaches at the University of Chicago. Not a single Goldman Sachs executive went to prison. The Justice Department investigated. Federal prosecutors reviewed the evidence, the emails, the testimonies. They concluded that while Goldman's behavior was ethically questionable, it didn't meet the threshold for criminal fraud. Why? Because Goldman argued, and prosecutors struggled to disprove, that their clients were sophisticated investors who understood the risks. That shorting securities while selling them wasn't illegal, just aggressive trading. The legal standard for criminal fraud is high. Prosecutors would need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Goldman had deliberately deceived clients with the intent to defraud. Goldman's lawyers successfully argued that market making and proprietary trading created inherent conflicts, but those conflicts weren't crimes. The system protected Goldman, the same system Goldman had helped design. Because here's what most people don't know. Goldman Sachs alumni were everywhere in government. Hank Paulson at Treasury during the crisis. Robert Rubin, former Treasury Secretary under Clinton, former co-chairman of Goldman. John Corzine, former Goldman CEO, became New Jersey governor and U.S. senator. The revolving door between Goldman and government wasn't conspiracy. It was resume building. Goldman executives were seen as experts, the brightest minds in finance. When they moved to public service, they brought Wall Street's perspective with them. The financial crisis did lead to reform. In 2010, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, the most comprehensive financial regulation since the Great Depression. The law created new oversight agencies, required banks to hold more capital, attempted to limit risky trading. The Volcker Rule, named after former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, restricted banks from making speculative bets with their own money. But Goldman adapted. They restructured their operations, shifted trading to different divisions, found loopholes. By 2013, Goldman's trading revenue was back to pre-crisis levels. What about the victims? The pension funds that lost billions, the insurance companies that collapsed, the university endowments that had to cut budgets, IKB Deutsche Industrie Bank, the German bank that lost $150 million on Abacus, had to be bailed out by the German government. German taxpayers covered the losses. Countless pension funds had to reduce benefits, delay retirements, cut cost of living adjustments. Retirees who'd worked their entire lives found their savings diminished. Some pension funds sued and won settlements, but settlements never made them whole. You can't recover trust. The broader economic damage was incalculable. The financial crisis caused the worst recession since the Great Depression. 8.7 million Americans lost their jobs. 8 million families lost their homes to foreclosure. The total economic cost, over $22 trillion in lost output and household wealth, according to the Government Accountability Office. Goldman's profit from their short positions, $13 billion. The math doesn't balance. It never will. Today, Goldman Sachs remains one of the most powerful financial institutions on earth. They've rebuilt their reputation, at least in part. They sponsor charities, tout diversity initiatives, publish reports on climate change. In 2009, Lloyd Blankfein gave an interview where he claimed Goldman Sachs was doing God's work. The statement became infamous, a symbol of Wall Street's detachment from reality. But Goldman survived. They always do. What does the Goldman Sachs story reveal about our financial system? First, it exposes a fundamental truth. On Wall Street, there's often no distinction between client service and self-interest. When banks are allowed to trade for themselves while advising clients, conflicts of interest aren't occasional, they're structural. Goldman's motto was, "Clients' interests always come first." But when the firm's own money was at stake, that principle evaporated. The incentive structure demanded it. Traders were paid on profits, not client satisfaction. When betting against clients became more profitable than serving them, the choice was obvious. Second, it demonstrates the inadequacy of regulation. The SEC, the agency responsible for policing Wall Street, was outmatched. Goldman had armies of lawyers, unlimited resources, and intimate knowledge of every regulatory loophole. Enforcement was always reactive, always years behind. The $550 million settlement, the SEC's historic penalty, was negotiated down from a potential multi-billion-dollar case. Goldman had leverage. They knew the government couldn't afford a long trial. The settlement was pragmatic, not just. Third, the Goldman story proves that in America's financial system, some institutions really are too big to fail and too powerful to prosecute. The decision not to bring criminal charges wasn't just legal calculus. It was pragmatic. Prosecuting Goldman might destabilize markets, trigger panic, cause more economic damage. Goldman knew this. They operated with implicit protection. Not immunity, but something close. The knowledge that the government needed them functional more than punished. But perhaps the darkest lesson is about trust. Goldman's clients, pension funds, insurance companies, endowments, relied on Goldman's expertise and reputation. They trusted that Goldman wouldn't sell them securities Goldman believed were worthless. Now, that trust was betrayed, systematically, deliberately, profitably. And here's the thing, it worked. Goldman made billions. Their executives kept their fortunes. The firm survived and thrived. The message to Wall Street was clear. Aggressive self-interest pays. The penalties are manageable. The rewards are enormous, so we have to ask, could it happen again? The answer is complicated. Dodd-Frank added safeguards. The Volcker Rule limits proprietary trading. Capital requirements force banks to hold more reserves. But regulations can be weakened. Since 2018, Congress has rolled back parts of Dodd-Frank. Lobbying by financial institutions, led by Goldman and others, has diluted enforcement. Wall Street's culture hasn't fundamentally changed. The compensation structures that incentivized Goldman's behavior in 2007 still exist. Traders still earn bonuses based on profits, not ethics. And the complexity of modern finance has only increased. Synthetic CDOs are gone, but new instruments, algorithmic trading, cryptocurrency derivatives, leveraged loans, create new risks and new opportunities for conflicts of interest. The question isn't whether sophisticated financial institutions will prioritize profit over clients. History tells us they will. The question is whether we'll recognize it before the next crisis, whether we'll demand accountability, whether we'll build a system where betraying clients has real consequences. Because what Goldman did, betting against the people who trusted them, wasn't a one-time aberration. It was a logical outcome of a system designed to reward short-term profits above all else. We can be angry at Goldman Sachs. We should be. But anger isn't enough. The system that enabled Goldman's behavior is still in place. The incentives haven't changed. The culture of Wall Street, where cleverness is celebrated and ethics are negotiable, persists until we fundamentally reform how we regulate finance, how we structure compensation, how we enforce accountability. The next Goldman is already out there, building the next scheme, creating the next crisis. The question is, will we see it coming? April 27th, 2010. Lloyd Blankfein sits before the Senate defending Goldman Sachs. Senator Levin asks him directly, "Do you think your conduct was proper?" Blankfein doesn't flinch. "Senator, we're a market maker. We have an obligation to provide liquidity." It's the perfect Wall Street answer, technically accurate, morally hollow, completely missing the point. Because the real question was never about market mechanics or legal obligations. It was about trust, about duty, about whether institutions that control trillions of dollars have any responsibility beyond maximizing profit. Goldman Sachs proved they don't, not because they couldn't, because they chose not to. They saw the crisis coming. They protected themselves. They profited while their clients burned, and they walked away billionaires. That's not a crime under American law. But it should haunt American conscience. The financial crisis destroyed $22 trillion in wealth. It devastated millions of lives. It exposed the fragility of a system we'd been told was safe. And Goldman Sachs, one of the institutions most responsible, paid fines, issued non-apology apologies, and returned to business as usual. The vampire squid is still out there, still wrapped around the face of humanity, still searching for the next opportunity. The question is, what are we going to do about it? If this story made you angry, good. That means you're paying attention. Subscribe to Corruption Rewind, because this isn't the only time Wall Street betrayed Main Street. We've got dozens of stories just like this one. Stories they hope you'll forget. Stories about insider trading, market manipulation, and billion-dollar cons that never made headlines. Hit that like button if you think someone needs to be held accountable. Drop a comment telling us what financial scandal we should investigate next. And share this video, because the more people who understand how the game is rigged, the harder it becomes to keep rigging it. Next up, we're exposing the collapse of Enron, where executives destroyed 20,000 lives and walked away with hundreds of millions. You won't believe what they got away with. Thanks for watching Corruption Rewind. And remember, when they say it's just business, it never is. It's always personal, especially to the people who lose everything.